Hi, welcome back to Cross-Cultural Management. We're going to be going and giving you an overview of weeks 5 and 6. Just the learning objectives. By the end of this period, you should be able to identify key factors in leading cross-culturally and different leadership styles, recognize key principles and patterns of business strategy in serving the bottom of the pyramid or base of the pyramid, communicate the importance of Indigenous leadership development as a part of your strategy, and you'll be working on the final project, the part that's going to be talking about strategic recommendations. Now, this diagram here is kind of a summary of the challenge of over 20 years of cross-cultural ministry experience. The fundamental problem is, we live in a broken world, and because of that, there's this divide of resources, there's a divide cross-culturally, there's all sorts of divides, right? And we try to build these bridges, and this image kind of pains me to look at this image, because you see someone who's built a bridge, then there's another part of the bridge, and then there's a missing part, and I'm just so sad that you can't get there. And I think that this is really a symbol of what often happens in nonprofits and even in businesses as we try to reach clients. There's such a strong pull to have our dominant culture of that of the funders, of that of the rest of society, that whenever we try to get our clients to come, it's just too far of a gap. And ultimately, sometimes what we end up doing, and this is the unhealthy aspect of missions, is we just can't get all the way there. So we say, good luck swimming to my culture. And they have to meet you on your terms. Now, there's some aspects of that that's healthy, because people are going to have to get used to that in society, and their employers are going to need that. But there's other aspects that aren't. There's an alternative approach. And that is really recognizing the importance of Indigenous leadership development. So instead of having this gap, what Indigenous leadership development does is it really bridges, it creates that bridge. And what you do is you get people who are coming from your client culture, and they learn to be bicultural. You get people who are coming from the dominant culture, and they learn to be bicultural. And ultimately, that's critical. So we have several readings and a talk on this. And even if you're a business, while this mainly applies to nonprofits, this is also really important for businesses. So that's the first part. A second part that this gets into an optional presentation on what I call systemic theology. This is not systematic theology. It's more what I call a theology of systems, or I even kind of jokingly said a theory of everything. And there's a longer talk that's optional, but if you're into the type of thing that's like a theory of everything, basically what it gets into is you can divide the world into 4 quadrants. So one that we've talked a lot about in this course is the individual versus collective. So that's the top of this diagram versus the bottom. The other is the interior versus the exterior. So what's going on inside your body, internally, what a pizza tastes like versus, the chemical composition, right? So this tool can be useful in a lot of ways. It can be useful for understanding, cross-cultural differences. And that's the part that I want to connect it with here. So if you want to go deeper, you can go into the full talk. It's a little over an hour. But the idea is, biblically it says we see through a glass darkly. That means we're seeing through a lens that distorts the world, right? And the glass is different colors for different people. And, what really happens is most people in the world, they only operate in one quadrant. Even, our training is basically divided into these quadrants. But also our personality types kind of bias us towards a quadrant. So in our culture will bias us to a quadrant. So if you are a big picture person, you're, in your Myers-Briggs, your big picture, you're going to tend a little more to the collective. Detail-oriented, you're going to tend a little more to the individual. That doesn't mean that everyone who goes that, has that personality is going to go that way. Thinkers often will do the external. Feelers will do more of the internal. Western culture is very focused on the individual and the external, whereas Eastern culture is more focused on the collective and the internal. Conservative politically often is focused on the individual, or liberal is more focused on the collective. Secular is more focused on the external. Religious often is focused on the internal, and Protestant is more individual, and Catholic is more collective. So all these things are ways we can get divided. I wanted to just highlight that presentation in case you want to do it. I'm going to use an example, but what's important is, we talk about having the body of Christ. We need kind of a whole approach. And I want to use one example of, taking a more four-quadrant approach towards addressing addiction. And in this slide, you can look at these four quadrants and you say, how are you going to take the exterior individual approach to addiction? So that's going to be kind of how science would approach it. So the biochemistry of addiction, you might have medical treatment, hereditary predisposition. It may be a problem. There's too easy access to drugs. People aren't taking good care of their body, have poor nutrition, and they might even have an emotional predisposition to addiction. Then, so you can deal with that side of the problem. Then there's another side. You're unemployed. There's parts of the country that have mass unemployment, and at the same time they have mass drug addiction because people are bored and they find something to fill the time, and other things, lack of emotional intelligence, spiritual emptiness, wounds from abuse, personal isolation, separation from God. This is what Western religion is really good at, dealing with this. And then the interior collective. So, that's really culture. So you might have things where there's subcultures where addiction is the norm. You have culture where drugs, alcohol, and sex and food and materialism are just promoted in the mass media. You have worship of all those things in the mass media. And then you have the other things, the exterior collective, so the breakdown of the family, the lack of jobs, the systemic oppression. So what's important is to recognize that we need to have, in our approach, we can't just say, okay, I'm going to be a friend to a poor person. We need to have other parts of the strategy. Now, part of the reason why I brought this up in this week, because this really could apply across all the weeks, is because the next section I'm going to be talking about business strategy. So business strategy really is getting at some of these, collective things, and often, at the external. So if you're serving the poor, there is a whole collective of knowledge of people who've been working with the poor from the business world. One of the main domains that's been termed is called BoP, bottom of the pyramid or base of the pyramid. So this kind of field was started by a guy, C.T. Prahalad, and he wrote a book called Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. Since then, there's been 20 different books in this space. But the idea behind this book is, he said, there's a common thread of business strategies that are serving, what he calls the base of the pyramid. And he uses that term. Sometimes people use the term majority world, but it's that there's a lot of people in the world who have low income. And, what you have to do is you have to start your design. So here's some of the principles. You have to start your design with a price. So this would apply to social enterprises, but some of these principles also will apply to how you serve the poor in a nonprofit. You start your design with, a price that the base of the pyramid could afford. So if you're offering some sort of product, you have to scale your operations. You have to de-skill work. You have to innovate on your processes. And I'm going to get into, what's the practical implications of this. So, you've often probably heard of the iron triangle of project management. You can pick cost, speed, and quality, pick 2 out of the 3, or sometimes you can only pick 1 depending on how important things are. And so there's key things to think about. So, and I'll just use an example. So say you're doing thrift stores right now. And thrift stores, there's some that are thriving, and there's some that honestly they're being crushed. And The reason why they're being crushed is because they don't understand these principles of base of the pyramid. So they don't understand that high volumes needed to achieve low cost. So they used to achieve low cost based on this third bullet point, which is labor and time is cheap for the poor. And they, you would run your program, and you would have the people from your program running your thrift store. But now the dollar store is beating you because they have higher volume than you, and they may be offering products. People, instead of going to your thrift store in your neighborhood, they're going to the dollar store, or they're going to some other budget store that has high scale. There's other principles like pay-as-you-go. Like if you look at the cell phones that are out there that are serving the low income, usually pay-as-you-go is the way to go. So there's many different case studies of how you have social enterprises. So thrift stores, as I mentioned, is an example. So you're going to have to figure out how do you make things be cost efficient. But there's a lot of ministries that are also doing catering businesses and culinary programs, and a lot of these principles apply. So you have to figure out how are you going to de-skill the work so that someone doesn't have to have high skills to do some of the work and things along those lines. So that's just an overview. Why are we, as you go into the base of the pyramid, bottom of the pyramid stuff, why are we doing that? Now, another thing is you work on projects, you're going to often, in business and social enterprise, you'll have to look at this project management triangle. And, if you're serving the poor, where you're on that triangle is going to change. So this is something we have to consider at City Vision often. If we're trying to provide an education and say we're going to serve in Ethiopia where, even the highest end colleges only cost $500 a year, you have to change the design dramatically. So, do you start with fixed quality design, or do you start with a fixed cost design? In Ethiopia, you have to start with, how can I provide an education for $500? Whereas in the U.S., generally they'll say, a lot of schools will say, how can I provide the best quality education? And then, okay, that's going to cost you $35,000. Now, the other thing is on speed, I think there's an adaptation frequency and a more adaptive design. So cultural minorities with limited resources often face environments with more unknowns than Western educators. So part of what I'm going to get at is you're going to have to adapt more as you're working in a cross-cultural setting. You can't just follow, always follow just the best practice. And then the other thing is quality. Often quality is basically defined in terms of what middle-class Western audiences want. And often how you define quality is going to be much more important how it's contextualized. So, for example, you could have a world-class movie, and if it's not in the language you can understand, that's not going to help you, right? So that's just an example. This is an example of how waterfall design works. And waterfall design basically is you're going to do a project, and you'll spend maybe the first year, and I'm using this example at City Vision. So in the way traditional schools work is they say, we're going to serve traditional students, we're going to, serve people in traditional fields, and then we're going to create courses. And, this whole process will take 5 years to develop a new course. But there's other ways in project management. And what I'm trying to do is translate the concept of project management and what are the elements of project management that are important to understand cross-culturally. So, waterfall is the more traditional way to approach project management, but then there's other approaches called Agile and Lean Startup. And so the difference is waterfall, you might take 5 years, launch a product, and get feedback. Agile, the idea is you might let's use this in a nonprofit example. You might spend 3 years designing a new program to serve, men, and then you launch it, and then you get feedback, and then in another 3 years you revise it. Whereas Agile, you might, slowly release new parts of the program each week. But the idea behind Lean is you would, maybe once a month make major modifications to the program and iterate until you get a good program, and then you can stabilize it. And that's the idea behind this lean startup. So some people have wondered, why do we use the lean startup as the framework in our social entrepreneurship course? There's a lot of different frameworks, but the main reason is because in a cross-cultural setting where you're serving the poor, where you're serving in an adaptive environment, you need to use a model like this. And the idea is you learn quickly, you build, and then you iterate and you measure, and you try to go through this as quickly as possible.